When we think of government today, we tend to think of public service, right? Well, in early 19th century Canada, that just wasn't the case. It was something totally different. It was all about preserving power and profit for a very, very exclusive club. So let's dive in and see how this whole thing actually worked. Seriously, just think about that for a second. What if your government was basically a private club and you weren't on the list? Every single decision about your life, your land, your future is being made by this tiny, closed circle of insiders. And guess what? They couldn't care less what you think. For most folks back in British North America, this wasn't a what if, it was just reality. Yeah, there's actually a word for this kind of setup. It's called an oligarchy. Basically, a few powerful people running the whole show. And in the 1800s, this wasn't some abstract political science concept. Nope, it was the system, the whole structure, all designed for one purpose: to keep power and money exactly where it was, with the elite. Okay, so who exactly were these guys in this exclusive club? Well, in British North America, you basically had two main crews, each running their own territory with, well, an iron grip. All right, so let's break this down. In what we now call Quebec, you had the Chateau clique. These were mostly English-speaking businessmen in a place that was overwhelmingly French-speaking, so you can bet they were nervous about losing their pull. Then, over in what's now Ontario, you had the Family Compact. These guys were super loyal to Britain and were terrified, absolutely terrified, of American-style democracy spilling across the border. So you see, they had different anxieties, but they shared the exact same goal: keep a hierarchical society with them, the Tory elite, right at the very top. Now, you gotta understand, this kind of total control wasn't just a fluke. It didn't happen by accident. These elites carefully built a system where every single lever of power was rigged to keep them in charge, and just as importantly, to lock everybody else out. And here's the playbook step by step. First, they totally dominated the appointed councils. And get this, these councils had way more power than the elected assembly. Next, they controlled all the jobs. You want to be a judge, a civil servant? You'd better be on their good side. This whole thing created what's called a patronage system. It was simple. If you were a friend, you got rewarded. If you were an opponent, you got punished. So let's be crystal clear about this. This wasn't about public service. Not at all. This was about using the power of the government for one thing and one thing only: making themselves and their buddies rich. And how did they do it? Well, they built private banks, like the Bank of Upper Canada. They funded private canal companies. Things that lined their own pockets. But what's really telling is what they didn't do. They deliberately, purposefully let the public road system fall apart. Why? Because it created a system that funneled money right back to them, even if it hurt regular people. And this quote right here just spells it out perfectly. I mean, think about it. If you're a farmer, you need roads to get your wheat to market, right? But the elite, they owned the canals. So they just neglected the roads. They forced farmers onto the Great Lakes and into the canals they controlled. It's just a blatant example of putting their own profits way, way ahead of the public good. Okay, so you might be thinking, what about the elected assembly? Surely that was the one place for an ordinary person's voice to be heard. Well, nope. The system was rigged to keep them out of there too. Just look at that number on the screen: 0. That's how much assembly members were paid. No salary, no money for travel, not even for a place to live. So who could possibly afford to do that job? Who could just drop their farm or their business for months on end, travel all the way to the capital, and pay for everything out of their own pocket? Yeah, only the rich. The system basically put up a giant keep out sign for everyone else. So it's one thing to favor the rich, but this system went way beyond that. It was designed to actively push people out. We're talking about the vast majority of the population who weren't just underrepresented, they were locked out of the political process completely. And it was all on purpose. This chart really paints a picture, doesn't it? Take a look at that tiny little slice of eligible voters. I mean, even if you were a man, you had to own property to even have a say. And then you have huge segments of the population, women, First Nations, who were almost entirely cut out of the process. The number of people who could actually participate, it was shockingly small. And for Indigenous peoples, this exclusion was just on another level. It wasn't just about not getting a vote. They weren't even seen as being part of the future of the colonies. European settlers believed that Indigenous cultures were just destined to die out, so they weren't consulted on anything, not even on huge decisions like Confederation. They were just left out of the picture entirely. All right, so even if you were one of the lucky few who actually could vote, the game was still rigged. The whole process was designed to make sure the establishment stayed in power. I mean, how do you vote when there's no secret ballot? Just imagine that. You walk up, you cast your vote, and everyone is watching. Your boss, your landlord, everyone. Would you really feel free to vote how you want? Well, they had a whole bag of tricks to control the outcome. For one, polling places were often miles away in market towns, making it a huge pain for anyone in the countryside to even show up. Two, like we said, voting was totally public, so you were a sitting duck for bribes or threats. And if that didn't work, oh, election officials were known to just fudge the numbers. And as a last resort, the Tory elites weren't above using vandalism and good old-fashioned violence to scare off any opposition. You know, a system this broken, this corrupt, it just can't last forever. Eventually, all that frustration, all that injustice, it just had to boil over. And it did, leading to a massive call for change, for a whole new way of running things. People tried to reform the system peacefully for years, but they just kept hitting a brick wall. So, eventually, they felt like they had no other choice. Armed rebellions actually broke out. And even though they were put down, they sent a loud and clear message all the way back to Britain. Things had to change. The way things were was just not sustainable. And that really kicked off the path to change. The rebellions basically forced Britain's hand. They sent over a guy named Lord Durham to investigate what on earth was going on. His report stirred up a lot of debate, but it laid the groundwork for the most important reform of all, which finally happened about a decade later, in 1848. And what was this game-changing idea? It was called responsible government. It sounds kind of formal, but the concept is actually pretty simple, and it changed everything. It meant that the government is accountable to the people through their elected assembly, not to some appointed elite. Basically, if the folks you elected didn't support the government, that government couldn't rule. Simple as that. And that was the reformers' whole argument in a nutshell. They were saying that the people we elect should be the ones with the real power. This was a direct shot, a complete challenge to the entire system that the Chateau clique and the family compact have built. And this is where it all comes together. In what was a truly historic moment, two politicians, Louis Hippolyte Lafontaine and Robert Baldwin, put aside their differences. They formed a government together, the very first one built on this brand new idea of being elected by and accountable to the people. It was a huge deal. So this whole story, this struggle from almost 200 years ago, it leaves us with a really big question, one that's just as important today as it was back then. How do we ensure that power serves the public, not just the privileged? Because that fight, the one to make government truly accountable to everyone, well, that's a fight that never really ends, does it?